So, with that in mind, I read through the book of Joel, which is only 3 chapters, and I have to tell you there's one phrase that really popped out at me. It was a phrase that he uses repeatedly, and Joel, along with the prophet Zephaniah, love this phrase more than just about any other author in the Bible. The phrase I'm talking about is the day of the Lord. And this phrase is used 5 different times in the in the prophecy of Joel. And when Joel uses this phrase 5 different times over 3 chapters, he really wants you to understand what the day of the Lord is. So this morning, we're going to look at the 5 different uses of the day of the Lord in the prophecy of Joel. It begins in Joel chapter 1, verse 15, when Joel writes, "Alas for the day of the Lord is near, and as destruction from the Almighty it comes." The second instance of this phrase is found in chapter 2 when Joel writes, "Blow the trumpet in Zion, sound the alarm on my holy mountain. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming. It is near, a day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and thick darkness." A few verses later, we come across the third use of this phrase when Joel writes, "The Lord utters his voice at the head of his army. How vast is the host. Numberless are those who obey his command. Truly, the day of the Lord is great." And if you're like me, you read, "Truly, the day of the Lord is great," and you say, well, at least there's one positive reference to the day of the Lord. But then Joel in the next line ruins it by saying, "Terrible indeed, who can endure it?" The fourth use is found at the end of chapter 2 when Joel writes, "The sun shall be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the great and terrible day of the Lord comes." And the last use of this phrase is found in chapter 3, "Multitudes, multitudes in the valley of decision, for the day of the Lord is near in the valley of decision. The sun and the moon are darkened and the stars withdraw their shining." Now it's here that when we look at Joel and the use of this phrase, we have to ask, did Joel share this opinion with others? Or was he unique in the way that he understood the day of the Lord, namely that it will be a day shrouded in darkness and thick clouds? So for that, we go to the very next book in the Bible, which is the prophet Amos, who also wrote about the day of the Lord. Amos in chapter 1 writes about the day of the Lord with these words, "Woe to those who wish for the day of the Lord. Why do you want the Lord's day of judgment to come? It will bring darkness, not light." A few more books to the right, we come across the prophet Zephaniah, which we studied last year. Zephaniah loves the phrase, "the day of the Lord," but he adds a word after it that really changes the whole context of the day of the Lord. We find that in Zephaniah 1 verse 18 where he writes, "Neither their silver nor their gold will be able to save them on the day of the Lord's wrath." And this is how Zephaniah refers to the day of the Lord. He goes on to write, "In the fire of his passion the whole earth shall be consumed. For a full, a terrible end, God will make all of the inhabitants of the earth." And when you Google image search the day of the Lord, you find some rather frightening images. I found this painting where everything's on fire and the sky is falling. I found this illustration where everything's on fire and the sky is falling. I found this picture where everything is on fire and the sky is falling. And I found this picture which just shows all these meteorites just barely missing what I think is the earth. And if we're serious about what the day of the Lord is, right? We're talking about the day of God. And we as a church love to tell other people, hey, you guys, God is love. And if that's true, I have a question I would like to ask. If the Lord is love and the Lord has a day, then shouldn't that day be a good day? I mean, I know I get accused of being liberal all the time, but I feel like this is a reasonable request. If God is love and we have a day of God, that should be a loving day, right? And instead of Google image searching the day of the Lord and getting an image like this, I feel like a much better picture that should show up is something like this. You know, the Care Bears. That should be what the day of the Lord is, right? I mean, this is a fair assumption, because if we're saying that God is good, then God should show up like this. And you should be able to type the day of the Lord into Google image search, And all sorts of happy, warm, fuzzy Care Bears should just invade your monitor, right? So with that in mind, I think we've got to look at this idea of the day of the Lord. And I want to look at this with 3 different questions that I think are important. And these 3 questions will frame the rest of this sermon. The first question we need to ask is, what exactly is the day of the Lord? The second question is, why is the day of the Lord terrifying? And the third question is, can the day of the Lord bring any kind of hope, peace, optimism, happiness, or joy to our overwhelming collective misery in 2020? Because let's face it, this year sucks, and we can feel ourselves already starting to give up on 2021. So those are the 3 questions we're going to ask, and I think they're 3 very important questions to ask. The first then, what exactly is the day of the Lord? Let's all get on the same page and define what this is. Well, we live here on earth, and most Christians I know, almost all Christians I know, will talk about how eventually there will be a day when we go to heaven. And when you think about these 2 things as realities, there's a lot of Christians that want to argue about whether these are literally true. I think it's important to talk about those things, but I also think it's important to talk about what both of these places represent. Because the earth represents the way things are, and heaven represents the way things should be. And while this may sound like I'm stepping out on a limb, almost every Christian intuitively believes this. And when we talk about every Christian, I mean like every Christian. Every Christian believes that there are the way things are here on earth, which is not the way that things should be as they will be in heaven. So there is some sort of separation between the way things are and the way things should be. I would argue that the separation that the prophets believed in was something that they called the day of the Lord. Now let me show you how this works. Because essentially you can look at several things that are not the way that they should be, that ultimately are, that once the day of the Lord comes along, those things will be corrected, and all of a sudden the way that things should be become the way things are. Let's look at our oceans. Now this is an island of trash, of plastic specifically, that is floating around in the Pacific Ocean right now. This is the way things are right now. Now, if you believe in heaven, you can probably believe in a clean ocean, an ocean that's open and wide and blue and beautiful and does not have plastic bottles floating around in it. So there are the way things are and the way things should be. There will be a day called the day of the Lord when this will become a reality and we will cut our plastic waste. Now, you can start to work toward that individually. We can start to work toward that collectively as a church, even as a nation. But this is going to take a lot of work, but there will all of a sudden be one day where we stop throwing our plastic into oceans. Another example of this is, I don't know about you, but I recently heard a term called doom scrolling, which is when you waste way too much time scrolling on your phone and you start and you're like, okay, just 10 minutes. And then an hour and a half later, you have doom scrolled away 90 minutes, right? We all know that this is fun for a little bit, but we don't think that that's the way things should be all the time. We all feel like we should have an active lifestyle. This is the way things should be. And there are those days, and I'm guilty of this, I am still waiting for the day of the Lord, where I will put down my phone and say, active lifestyle is ultimately the most important thing. And the day that I put the phone down and commit fully to an active lifestyle will be a day that is known as the day of the Lord. I took this picture yesterday here at Paradox. It's kind of sad. This is where we used to meet. I took this picture and it just hasn't had the same kind of feel ever since the pandemic started because we're not meeting in person. And when I look at this picture, it's not the way things should be because I'm reminded of all of the happy memories when we used to gather. There will be a day where we get to meet again, which is the way things should be, and that day is the day of the Lord. So what exactly is the day of the Lord? I think this is really important for us to understand, and I think that all 3 prophets that reference the day of the Lord would agree with this definition. The day of the Lord is the moment when the way things should be become the way things are. When the way things should be become the way things are. And when that happens, that is what the day of the Lord is. Now let me show you how this works, because as you are reading through the book of Joel, you may say, Okay, sure. Then why is the day of the Lord terrifying? Which is our second question that we are asking this morning. To answer this question, we got to go to the Bible. And I don't mean to get like real theologically challenging here, but there's something that's really important that needs to be said. The Bible was written by human beings. Now, I know some Christians would love to fight me on this because they think that God dictated each and every word of the Bible, but I think the people who put the Bible together ultimately wanted us to remember that the Bible is first and foremost written by human beings. You may ask how I know that, and to do that, I'd like to go to all of the books of the Bible. Here is book number 29, Joel, which we are studying. Now, Joel is not unique in the Bible because it's one of 29 other books that are written by authors who named their writing after themselves, okay? So there are 30 books in the Bible that are named after the author who wrote them. If the people who put the Bible together really wanted us to believe that God wrote each and every book of the Bible, they would have renamed these 30 books into 1st through 30th God, and we would be studying 8th God right now. So, Joel, right here, is a real person and a real human being like you and me. Now, Joel, being a real human being, lived in a real place, which was somewhere around Jerusalem. Now, we don't know exactly when the book of Joel was written, but our best guess, as covered by Pastor Mandy last week, was that it was sometime in the 4th century BCE. So Joel lived 2,400 years ago. A lot has changed between now and then. And when we consider those things, you can start to answer the question, why is the day of the Lord so terrifying? Joel, 2,400 years ago, writes these words, "Hear this, O elders," in chapter 1. "Give ear, all inhabitants of the land. Has such a thing happened in your days or in the days of your ancestors? Tell your children of it, and let your children tell their children, and their children another generation." Then here in verse 4, something very important happens. Joel writes, "What the cutting locust left, the swarming locust has eaten. When the swarming locust left, the hopping locust has eaten. And what the hopping locust left, the destroying locust has eaten." So here Joel is writing about different types of locusts eating all kinds of vegetation, specifically crops. Now, I've never had a locust invasion in my town, but this is not a thing of the past. In fact, this picture was taken in 2020 in Kenya. This is a locust plague. And in certain sections of the world, locust plagues are a really big deal. Such a big deal that the United Nations actually has appointed to a real position the UN Food and Agriculture Organization's Senior Locust Forecasting Officer, which is a man named Keith Cressman. Now, Keith Cressman has said this about Kenya right now in 2020, who is dealing with the coronavirus just like America is. He says in Kenya, it's the worst outbreak they've had to face in the last 70 years. So you can imagine that all of these locusts are coming to Kenya. Kenya, which already is facing food shortages, has all these locusts descend on their country. And there's this question that rises up. Why is this happening to us? Now, because we live in the year 2020, we can answer this question. And we answer this question by going to Planet Earth 2 and watching through and going to the part that talks specifically about locusts, because they give a lot of answers about why locusts swarm and eventually result in a plague. Now, if you watch Planet Earth, you can find a number of interesting facts shot in front of beautiful cinematography, but some things that we need to know about locusts to understand the book of Joel. An adult locust eats its own body weight each day. Imagine doing that. Knowing how much you weigh, imagine eating your entire body weight in food each day. These guys are incredibly and devastatingly efficient eaters. When food begins to run out, winged adults release pheromones to signal movement. So these guys eat a lot of food, they start eating, and then when food starts to run out, they start to signal each other with pheromones. They all get up and start to leave together in groups. The adults then travel in groups, and the groups of locusts merge into swarms. Swarms then always travel with the wind, and the wind is always blowing toward low pressure. In other words, the wind funnels swarms together, and those swarms eventually become a plague. Now, a plague comprises of several billion locusts, and it covers ground up to 40 miles wide. So it's not like there's just one picture here. You could drive for 40 miles and see locusts this thick. Now, because this is such a problem and it can devastate areas that are already facing food shortages, there are people who have acted to do some incredible work to try and combat locust swarms and try to predict where they are so they can ship food ahead of where the locust swarm is. Thanks to the amazing folks at Esri, which is just down the road from here, they've mapped out the locust swarms of 2020 through some amazing work. The United Nations has appointed people to help combat the locust swarms, and there's even chemicals that are low impact pesticides that they can use to fight locust swarms in order to protect food so that human beings can eat. We have all of these solutions for how to combat it and all of this science for how to understand it, which Joel didn't have 2,400 years ago. Now you can imagine that Joel and the people of Jerusalem woke up and saw a locust plague and said, "Oh, why is this happening to us?" Because this would be a frightening experience, right? And what we have to acknowledge is that Joel is a real human being before the scientific method, before Esri can map all of these locust swarms out. And Joel is living through a terrifying experience, which is a locust plague. So Joel lived through a terrifying experience, and then Joel interpreted that terrifying experience through his theological framework and not the other way around. This is really important to understand because what it tells us is that God didn't show up and say, "Joel, I'm really angry with Israel, I'm really angry with Jerusalem, so I'm going to send a plague of locusts and they're going to devastate the economy of Jerusalem." That's not the way the Bible was written. Instead, Joel saw a plague of locusts. It felt like God was angry with Jerusalem, and so Joel then writes a prophecy about how God is angry with Jerusalem. It doesn't work the other way around. So, what Joel tells the people of Jerusalem is that God sent this plague of locusts to bring the way things should be into the way things are. Joel looked at Jerusalem and he said, "We're not living the most ethical lifestyle here. Heaven is different than what Jerusalem is right now. God sent this plague of locusts to get us to change, because if we change, then God will remove the locusts and God will be happy that we are working toward the way things should be." Now, I don't know about you, but when you have your food supply cut off, it is a very anxious situation. I think of a story that takes place a long ways from here in a town called Wanham, Alberta. Now, I'm guessing that you've never heard a sermon talk about the city of Wanham, Alberta, because in 2016, the population was 124 people. Nobody lives in Wanham, Alberta. But back in 1959, my great-grandfather, David Weigel, moved to Wanham, Alberta, and he planted a wheat farm, and this picture was taken of him on his wheat farm in 1959. Now, my mother would go up and visit him, and there was a summer a couple years after this picture was taken in the 60s where they visited Grandpa Weigel on his wheat farm. And while they were there during a summer day, there was a terrible hailstorm. And hail came and destroyed all of Grandpa Weigel's wheat farm, and his crop was gone in an instant. My mom tells me the story about how she watched Grandpa Weigel weep at the fact that his economic security had been taken out from under him by a hailstorm. Now, in 2020, a few years later, about 6 decades later, I don't know if you've been to the grocery store. It's gotten a lot better than it was a couple months ago, but I remember how much anxiety I had going to the grocery store and seeing empty shelves. I remember going to the grocery store and seeing that they were running low on eggs. And although eggs weren't on my shopping list, I was like, we got to get eggs because we got to stock up because we're not sure if they're going to be back soon. And it's a real frightening thing when your food supply, your economic security begins to get cut off, right? And so here we have this locust plague attack the food supply of Jerusalem, and there's this terrifying experience, and Joel's convinced, because he doesn't have science, because he doesn't have maps, Joel's convinced that God wants the people of Jerusalem to change but he acknowledges the danger and the devastation that all of the people of Jerusalem faced in light of losing their food to locusts. In Joel chapter 1, he writes, "Be dismayed, you farmers. Wait, you vine dressers, over the wheat and the barley. Wail, you vine dressers, over the wheat and barley, for the crops of the field are ruined. The vine withers, the fig tree droops, pomegranate, palm, and apple. All the trees of the field are dried up. Surely joy withers away among the people." So we ask the question, why is the day of the Lord terrifying? I think the answer is because life at times presents us with terrifying realities. And Joel lived through a terrifying experience, and the only way he could rationalize it, reconcile it with his theology, was that God was angry with the people of Jerusalem. Now, we have a very different answer in 2020 due to science, but we can understand why these biblical prophets wrote about the day of the Lord in such terrifying terms. They lived through terrifying experiences. And so the way they interpreted it and understood it was that things weren't the way that they should be, so God wants us to change, and they would use those events as a catalyst for change. So that is why the day of the Lord is portrayed as a terrifying event within the biblical prophetic narrative. Which brings us to the third question. Can the day of the Lord bring any kind of hope, peace, happiness, optimism, or joy to our overwhelming collective misery in 2020? Because let's face it, this year sucks and we can feel ourselves already starting to give up on 2021. The answer to this question, in my opinion, is yes. And yes in a large font as well as bold letters. I really believe that it can help us. Because when we look at all of the anxiety, the misery, the sadness, the economic hardship, and the isolation that we are facing in 2020, when you look back at what the day of the Lord was and how the prophets interpreted, we can only come to the conclusion that all of this stuff is the day of the Lord in 2020. And I believe that if Joel, Amos, and Zephaniah were writing today, if they lived with us today and they knew all about the science that we know about, they would write about today as being the day of the Lord, the day when things are supposed to change. Now, to give you an example of this, I want you to think of all that we've had to let go in 2020. And when you have to think about all that we've had to let go in 2020, I actually went back through my photo roll from 2019, and I just started saving pictures of things that we don't do in 2020 anymore. And at some point I was like, okay, this sermon can't be 3 hours long. So I cut off like 90% of the pictures. But here are a few that I wanted to share with you of things that I've had to let go. In January of 2019, I went to Disneyland with my kids. And this was a fantastic experience. But we can't go to Disneyland anymore, can we? We can go to Disney World, which I wouldn't recommend, but we can't go to Disneyland. And it's something that we've lost. In February of 2019, I went to a funeral of a dear friend. And man, funerals, we knew they were important before, but now they're just so complex and there's so many negotiations and so much communication that's required to hold them. And I missed the day when the most important thing about funerals is that we just come together and grieve. In April of 2020, I got the honor and privilege of dedicating Amelia Thomas. Millie Thomas is how she goes by. I got the honor to dedicate her, and we've had to cancel a couple baby dedications in 2020, and this is one of the highlights of my job. Also in May of 2019, I got to go see Gungor in concert. I don't get to go to many concerts anymore because, I have kids, but this was one of my highlights of 2019. Graduations, here I am with the medical school class of 2019, celebrating. Weddings with David and Liz Ruckel, whose wedding I went to last year. I've been to a wedding this year. It's great. It's not quite the same. I think everybody understands that. I haven't been out to eat since COVID hit. I miss going out to restaurants. This is a vegan pork chop by Thomas Keller in his restaurant Ad Hoc. It's phenomenal. This cloud is mashed potatoes. This thing was amazing. I think about last year, we got to go visit my nephew, Ben. in the hospital after he was born. I mean, we don't do this anymore, right? I got to celebrate Pride in downtown Redlands, and I became a fan of the band Hoity Toity, which blew the roof off the place, which was really impressive because there was no roof to begin with. I got to ride trains with my son. It's one of his favorite things to do. My daughter loves school more than life itself. And if you're a parent right now with kids, you know the agonizing decision of what to do with your kids and with school is how difficult it's been. And then this next picture, I'm afraid that you might think I'm a poser, but this is actually dancing at Maddie and Jordan's wedding. And I'm not like a great dancer. I'm not really a dancer at all, but I do miss this wild joy that is dancing. And I just miss enjoying an evening with dancing with friends and family at weddings. I got to go just this last week. My wife asked me, she's like, how do you think Halloween's gonna work? And I look back at these pictures and I say, well, probably not the way it was before. And then last year, one of the highlights was my daughter singing in a Christmas program at her preschool, which my son was supposed to be at. And he was supposed to be in this Christmas program, and it's a highlight for my wife and me. And we're not sure it's gonna happen. And I look at all these memories from 2020, and they're all the good times and all the good things that we used to do back then that we can't do now, and they've all just started to fade into distant memories. And on top of all the good stuff that was there, there's also all the weird stuff, the stuff that you don't miss that much, right? Like 2019 for my wife and I and our kids was really busy. Like we were going to events all the time. It was hard for us to find time as a family to sit down and eat a meal together. But all of that busyness is gone. I would love to be busy again. And when we look at all that disappeared, now that all that's gone, there's a few questions we need to ask as we consider where we are in 2020 and the life that happens after this. What is worth bringing back? I mean, it's all gone. And so when we start to rebuild something, what is it that's worth actually bringing back, and what needs to be let go? And what is it that needs to be created that we didn't have before? And so 2020, while it's been, obviously there's been a lot of suffering and it's been really difficult for a lot of us, 2020 is starting to make us ask a lot of important questions. And the longer that this goes on, the more these questions are pressing, and they're asking, why do you need to do these things? You don't have to go back to the way it was before. You can change whenever things start to open up again. And these three questions here, what is worth bringing back, what needs to be let go, and what needs to be created, are three questions that ultimately speak to redemption. And the idea that while 2020 is terrible and it's terrifying and there's sadness all in the mix of this, there's something good that can come out of this, right? And if we go back to the way things were before, exactly as they were in 2019, we've failed to redeem 2020, and instead, we've just said it's just a tragedy and a waste of time. So when we talk about what the day of the Lord is here in 2020 and all that we've given up, and the description that the prophets would assign to this year that we're going through, the day of the Lord in 2020 is an invitation to something greater than we had before. 2020 is an invitation that asks us, what is it that really matters to you in your life? And I'll tell you, I've been discouraged throughout this year, and it's this idea that keeps me going forward, this idea that we can create something better because of this, not in spite of it. And when you look back at Joel's writing, yes, there are some gloomy words around the day of the Lord, but there's also this phrase or this idea or this theme that runs throughout his prophecy about redemption. God says to Joel at one point, "Yet even now, return to me with all your heart." And so Joel lives through this locust plague. He asks the question, why is this happening to us? The answers don't really seem satisfying given modern science and how we can understand how locusts work today. So that question begins to fade into the background. But the thing that survives from this prophecy is Joel telling us, look, this plague of locusts is terrifying. but I think God can redeem this disaster. To give an example of how this works for 2020, Joel at the beginning of his prophecy writes some words that I read earlier, but I want you to imagine that he's actually writing about 2020 instead of a plague of locusts. He writes, "Hear this, O elders. Give ear, all inhabitants of the land. Has such a thing happened in your days or in the days of your ancestors? Tell your children of this pandemic, and let your children tell their children, and their children another generation." In other words, Joel's vision is so that people who are hearing the story of the locust plague may be able to tell their children about how things changed from that moment forward. About how they didn't used to store food in case things went bad, and then all of a sudden the locust plague hit and they said, maybe we should make sure we have enough food in case locusts show up again. Maybe it was people looking around and saying, you know what? We've got to make sure that even if you can't afford to eat after a locust plague, that we have enough food for everyone. And so we changed the society. The day of the Lord made us more compassionate toward those who cannot afford food all the time. That's the story of redemption. That's what this prophecy is working toward. And I believe that if Joel was here preaching to you instead of me, I believe that he would tell you and me that the year 2020 can be redeemed. That this thing can be something that changes something better, that we can tell our children one day. Let me tell you what we learned in 2020. We learned about the importance of bringing healthcare to every person. We learned about the importance of having humility and accepting that pandemics can happen to us. We learned as a family to refocus on what was important, to make sure that we're not busy all the time. We learned as a family that when we have financial disaster, we found ways to band together and survive. We found that 2020 was the year that put us on a better course than we had yesterday. And so I hope that when you read the book of Joel, you read through it with its redemption language, and you read about the plague of locusts that Joel faced, and you think to yourself, this is so similar to what we experience now in 2020. And if God could redeem a plague of locusts 2,400 years ago, maybe God can redeem the year 2020. Maybe it's not worth giving up on this year yet. Maybe we can change and create something better. 2020 is a year of redemption. And my hope and my prayer is that each of us can personally see it this way so that we can create something better, to make the way that things should be into the way that things are. So may we see and embrace Jesus Christ in all, even the year 2020. Amen.